Delta Force commander retires quietly until a gang of bikers pushes him too far. Colonel James Hawk Hunter, a decorated Delta Force commander, had spent over 20 years in the heart of battle, leading covert missions that no one would ever know about. His reputation was legendary, silent, deadly, and feared by enemies. To some, he was a shadow on the battlefield, a man who struck from the darkness, never leaving a trace. To others, he was a nightmare, a force of nature that no one could outrun. His name carried weight, whispered by the desperate, the broken, and the bloodied. They knew who Hawk was, and they feared him. No longer could strangers beg Boney's aid after spending their power under him. But after the war, after the countless missions, the endless nights of terror and survival, Hawk had had enough. He was a man who had seen too much, lost too much. He had stared death in the face so many times that it had become a distant acquaintance, and now he just wanted peace. He found it in the hills of North Carolina, a small, remote cavern hidden deep in the forest, far from the noise of the world, a life in seclusion, surrounded by the whispering pines and the gentle hum of nature. Hawk didn't need the world anymore. He didn't need the bloodshed or the violence. He had fought for too long, and now he sought only silence. The tranquility of the hills became his refuge. For 2 years, Hawk lived a life he had never imagined, a life far removed from the chaos that had defined him for so long. Every morning, he would rise before dawn, go for a long solitary run through the winding trails of the forest. He would spend his afternoons fixing old vehicles he found abandoned in the woods, or sitting by the lake, fishing in the stillness. His only companions were the birds, the wind, and his own thoughts. The weight of his past seemed to grow lighter with every day that passed in this isolated haven. But Hawk knew better than to believe that peace would last forever. He had lived through enough to understand that peace was a fragile thing, like a bird perched on a branch, always at risk of being blown away by the next gust of wind. The past had a way of coming back, no matter how far you ran, and Hawk knew that sooner or later it would catch up to him. The necessary actions were going to be needed at some point, but it would be necessary for it to come to him first. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Hawk sat alone, his mind at ease for the first time in a long while. He'd just finished a run, his muscles aching in the best possible way, and had prepared a simple meal. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and freshly cooked food. Hawk felt at peace. It was in this moment, as the world seemed to settle into an almost unnatural stillness, that his phone buzzed. The sudden vibration in the otherwise quiet cabin made Hawk's heart skip a beat. He rarely received messages. He'd cut ties with everyone he could. And yet, there it was, a message from an unknown number. Hawk's instincts flared. He reached for the phone and read the text. It was short, direct, and unsettling. "They're coming for you, Hawk." His stomach tightened as he read the words over and over. They weren't a threat, they weren't a warning, they were a statement of fact. Someone knew where he was, someone from his past, someone who had come to collect what they were owed. Hawk could feel the weight of his former life pressing in on him. It had been 2 years of running, 2 years of hiding, and now it was catching up to him. He dropped the phone onto the table, his mind racing. The message was vague, but Hawk knew exactly what it meant. It was a warning. Someone from his past had found him, and they weren't coming to offer peace. They were coming to settle old scores, debts that Hawk had long since tried to forget. The fire crackled louder, almost mocking him as the warmth of the cabin suddenly felt distant. Hawk's eyes drifted to the window, his mind spinning. He had fought battles all over the world, confronted countless enemies, and faced death head-on. But none of that seemed to matter now. Not when the past had finally come for him. That night, Hawk couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. Who could it be? The message was too cryptic to be a coincidence. Was it someone from his days in the Delta Force? One of the many missions he had led that had left bodies in his wake? Or was it someone from his time before the military? Someone with a grudge? Hawk had made enemies in all corners of the world, and each one of them had their own reason to hate him. By morning, he had made up his mind. He would face whatever was coming. He would not run. The hills, the lake, the cabin, it was all a fragile illusion. Hawk had known that for a long time, but the truth had become impossible to ignore. The past was always there, lurking just below the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise up and tear apart everything you had built. The first sign came as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the trees. The sound of engines roared in the distance, deep, powerful, unmistakable. Hawk's heart skipped a beat as he stood on the porch, staring out into the valley. The noise grew louder, louder still, until the ground itself seemed to tremble under the weight of dozens of motorcycles. The Red Serpent. Hawk didn't need to see them to know who they were. The roar of their engines, the deep growl of the motorcycles, the way the sound echoed through the hills. It was unmistakable. The Red Serpents were known for their ruthlessness, their thirst for power, and their viciousness. A gang that didn't just take what they wanted, they crushed everything in their path. And they had come for him. Hawk's eyes narrowed as he watched the gang circle his cabin. There were dozens of them, all clad in leather jackets adorned with the Red Serpent's insignia, a symbol of death, of destruction, of everything Hawk had fought against in his past. The leader of the gang, a giant of a man with a beard that seemed to cover half his face, dismounted his bike and walked toward Hawk. His every step was measured, deliberate, and Hawk knew it wasn't just a visit, it was a reckoning. The leader's voice was low, rough, and cold as he spoke. "Hawk, you've been hiding too long." Hawk didn't flinch. He had seen men like this before, men who thought they could intimidate him, break him. But Hawk was not the man he had been when he first joined the military. He was a different creature now. But that didn't mean he wasn't ready for the storm that was coming. "What do you want?" Hawk asked, his voice calm, steady, though his mind was racing. He could feel the tension in the air, could sense the danger in every breath. "I want what you owe me," the leader replied, stepping closer. His eyes were filled with rage and a thirst for vengeance. Hawk didn't move. He didn't need to. He had already made his decision. He was going to fight. He was going to defend everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. His life, his peace. It wasn't just his to lose. The leader smiled, a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you've escaped your past, Hawk. You think you can live in peace after everything you've done. You can't outrun what's coming for you." Hawk's hand hovered near the small sidearm he kept hidden inside the door, but he knew weapons wouldn't solve this. This wasn't a fight that could be won with a gun. This was a fight for his soul. "You got no idea what's coming for you," the leader said with a laugh, "but I'll make sure you regret it." Hawk's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. This wasn't just a fight for his cabin or his life. This was a fight for redemption. The storm had arrived. The past was here, and Hawk was ready. The leader of the gang, a towering figure named Viper, led the charge with a sense of purpose that matched the rumble of the engines behind him. His presence was commanding, like a storm on the horizon, and his leather jacket bore the unmistakable emblem of the Red Serpent. Crimson snakes winding around a dagger, a symbol of death and destruction. Viper's cold, calculating eyes never left Hawk as he approached, his massive frame towering over the rest of the bikers. "You must be the legend." Viper's voice dripped with mockery as he dismounted his bike, a wicked grin playing at the corners of his mouth. He paused, sizing up Hawk as though he were an insect under a microscope. The one who disappeared into the hills, thinking he could outrun his demons. Well, guess what, Hawk? Your past has caught up with you. We've come to collect. Hawk didn't flinch. His face remained impassive, as always. Years of battle-hardened discipline allowed him to mask the storm brewing inside. The air felt heavy, but his chest rose and fell with measured breaths, his body poised like a coiled spring. "I was," Hawk replied calmly. He didn't need to add more. Viper would know what that meant. Hawk wasn't the same man who had once led covert missions in foreign lands, but he was still dangerous, still capable of handling what the world threw at him. Viper circled him like a predator, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots louder than the chirping of birds in the distance. His eyes gleamed with malice as he sized up the retired commander, his voice laced with arrogance. "We've got a new territory to claim, old man, and your little cabin is right in the way. You're going to make sure we get it, peacefully. No one needs to get hurt, do they?" The words were designed to unsettle, to break Hawk's calm demeanor, but they didn't land. Hawk's silence was a calculated response. He wasn't going to play into Viper's games. Hawk had survived worse than this. He had faced down entire armies, fought in the shadows where the stakes were far higher. His mind was already in tactical mode, running through every possible scenario. Viper's men, dozens of bikers, were spread out, each one wearing a sneer or a look of arrogance, revving their engines, watching for any sign of weakness. Hawk knew what they were trying to do. They were attempting to wear him down with their noise, with their presence. But Hawk had trained his entire life to tune out distractions, to focus on the task at hand. And right now, the task was clear: protect what was his. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Viper warned, his voice dripping with menace. "We can take what we want, but if you step aside, we'll let you live." The subtlety of the threat wasn't lost on Hawk. Viper wasn't just offering a chance to live. He was offering submission, surrender. He expected Hawk to bow down, to relinquish the life he had built for himself, to hand over his peace. And that would never happen. Hawk's grip tightened around the edge of his porch, his body bracing for what was coming next. "You've got a choice, Hawk," Viper repeated, his voice low and deliberate. "Step aside or face the consequences." Hawk stood still, his gaze unwavering. His heart was calm, too calm, like the stillness before a storm. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight, to protect. But there was more at stake here than just a fight. This was about more than territory or power. It was about principle, about refusing to be controlled. His life wasn't for sale, and Hawk had never been the type to bow down. "I don't back down." Hawk's voice was like ice, cold and implacable. The words cut through the tension like a knife. There was no bravado, no threats of violence, just an undeniable certainty. Hawk wasn't going to let them take his home, his peace, his future. Viper's smile faltered, and Hawk saw the flicker of rage in his eyes. He had expected submission, maybe a plea, or even some hesitation. Instead, Hawk's unflinching resolve only seemed to fuel Viper's fury. Viper motioned to his men, and the bikers revved their engines in unison, a deafening roar that shattered the quiet serenity of the valley. Hawk's instincts flared, his body on high alert as he took a step back, moving fluidly despite the tightness in his chest. His mind was already calculating the moves, the angles, the weaknesses. This wasn't just a gang. This was an ambush, a challenge that Hawk couldn't afford to lose. The circle around him tightened. Viper's men began to inch closer, like wolves closing in on a wounded prey, each rev of their bikes pushing Hawk closer to the edge. Hawk's chest tightened. His mind was a battlefield, calculating his options. He could take down one or two of them before they overwhelmed him, but that wouldn't end it. If it escalated too much, they'd burn the cabin down in retaliation. They'd bring more, worse than just this crew of bikers. You think you can fight us all? Viper taunted, leaning closer, his breath hot with malice. We outnumber you, old man. There's no way you can win. Hawk's jaw clenched. The situation was spiraling fast. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He had already made up his mind. This was not just about fighting. It was about survival, about protecting everything he had worked for, and proving that he had the strength to face whatever came at him, even if it meant standing alone. Without another word, Viper signaled. His men surged forward, a wave of leather and metal, their engines screaming as they revved their bikes with ferocity. Hawk knew he had only moments before the situation turned violent, before the chaos escalated beyond control. But Hawk was ready. His body moved with the precision of a seasoned soldier, every step calculated, every motion a response to the imminent threat. The first biker came at him, charging forward like a beast in the wild, his engine growling like thunder. But Hawk was already in motion. With lightning speed, he dodged the biker's reckless charge, his hand darting to his side to grab the first weapon he could reach, an old rusted wrench from the toolshed by the porch. With a quick, practiced motion, Hawk swung the wrench in a clean arc, catching the biker's shoulder. The impact sent the man flying from his bike, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. But before the others could react, Hawk was already moving again, his mind 2 steps ahead. His fight wasn't just with these men, it was with the ghosts of his past, the ones that whispered that his life would always be defined by violence. This was the moment he proved them wrong. Viper's voice rang out above the noise of the engines, his fury growing as his men began to close in, but Hawk was already in the thick of it. A wave of action surged, each moment flashing by like a scene in a war-torn battlefield. Hawk wasn't just fighting for his life anymore, he was fighting for everything he had earned. And as the first biker fell, the rest of the gang hesitated. Hawk's reputation, the one Viper had mocked, was no joke. It wasn't the legend they feared, but the man who stood before them, ready to burn everything to protect the only thing that mattered now, his peace. The bikers didn't take kindly to Hawk's defiance. Their eyes burned with rage as Viper, with a snap of his fingers, issued a deadly command. His men revved their engines, the sound of motorcycle engines roaring like an approaching storm. They were here to break him, to force him into submission. But Hawk was no stranger to challenge. In a world where danger lurked around every corner, retreat wasn't an option. It was never an option. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle tucked away inside his cabin, the same rifle that had seen him through countless missions, through the blood and grit of wars and covert operations. As his fingers brushed the familiar steel, his mind cleared. Hawk was no longer a man seeking peace. He was a man who had been thrust back into the crucible of battle. His body moved with the fluidity of someone who had lived for this moment. The air crackled with tension. Hawk stepped out onto the porch with the calm of a man who knew that no matter the odds, this was his fight. He could feel the heat of the bikers' glare as they moved toward him. Without a word, Hawk lunged forward. His movements were a blur, an expert honed by years of battle. The first biker came at him like a bull, wielding a steel crowbar. With a sudden shift of his body, Hawk sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and using his momentum against him. A brutal knee to the stomach sent the man stumbling backward, gasping for air, as Hawk followed up with a quick strike to his ribs. The biker crumpled to the ground, his crowbar slipping from his hands, discarded in the dirt. Before the next biker could make a move, Hawk was already on him, his elbow crashing into the man's throat, cutting off any chance of a scream. The biker hit the ground in a heap, choking and gasping for breath, unable to process what had just happened. Viper stood still, watching in disbelief. His crew, the feared Red Serpents, the men he had chosen for their ruthlessness, were falling like dominoes in front of Hawk. The man was a force, a living legend who had been through hell and returned stronger. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Viper's face twisted into a scowl, the mockery in his eyes turning into something darker. He had underestimated Hawk. He had made the mistake of believing Hawk was just an old soldier living out his days in peace. Hours later, with a furious yell, Viper stormed forward, his fists raised to strike, but Hawk was ready. The moment Viper lunged, Hawk met him with an explosion of power. He grabbed Viper mid-air, using the full weight of his Delta Force training to slam him to the earth with bone-crushing force. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, echoing like a thunderclap. Viper's breath left his body with a sickening thud. His eyes widened in shock. His pride shattered, and blood seeped from a cut on his lip as he struggled to breathe. "You're insane," Viper spat, his voice thick with disbelief. Hawk knelt next to him, his gaze cold and unwavering. He looked down at Viper like a predator sizing up its prey. "No, Viper," he said, his voice low and steely. "I'm not insane. I'm just a man who's lived through hell and survived. And you're not taking a single damn thing from me." With a swift motion, Hawk knocked the weapon from Viper's hand, sending it skidding across the dirt. Viper's eyes flickered with panic as he tried to rise, but Hawk wasn't done. Hawk's voice was like iron. "The Red Serpents are finished here, and you're the last one to know it." The remaining bikers, now witnessing their leader's humiliation, hesitated. The air was thick with the scent of defeat. Hawk didn't wait for them to rethink their strategy. He moved in a blur, striking with lethal precision. A sharp elbow, a knee to the face, and a vicious kick sent the gang scattering. They retreated, humiliated, broken, their sense of invincibility shattered by a man who had nothing left to lose. Viper groaned on the ground, his face contorted in pain. "This isn't over, old man," he snarled, his voice laced with venom. "We'll be back for you." Hawk didn't allow him to finish. His cold eyes narrowed, and his words rang out like a final judgment. "Next time you come for me, it won't just be me you'll have to worry about. It'll be the ghosts of everyone you've hurt." The Red Serpents, broken and battered, climbed back onto their bikes. The roar of their engines echoed through the valley, their once confident sounds now tinged with defeat. Slowly, they retreated, disappearing into the hills, the remnants of their gang scattered in the wake of their failed mission. As the last of the bikers faded into the distance, Hawk stood tall, chest heaving as the adrenaline ebbed away. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the peaceful solitude he had once known. No, this was the quiet after a storm he had just weathered. His world had irrevocably changed, and the calm he had sought for so long was now gone. The sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Hawk knew in his bones that his retirement had come to an end. There would be no more peace. He had made that clear today. But there was one thing he was sure of. He would never back down. As long as he drew breath, he would fight for what was his, and he would defend the life he had fought so hard to rebuild.